time for a bit of Wednesday night common sense with two of my favourite business writers who can unravel the doublespeak of our corporates and some of the economic issues in particular around this week. Joining me tonight is economics columnist at The Australian and also the Herald Sun, Mr Terry McCrann, and economics editor at the Australian newspaper, Adam Creighton. Thank you both for your time. Adam, I'm going to start with you because I know you've written about superannuation a lot in the past. A big report out today by the Creighton Institute to say that when Australia lifts from the current 9.5% compulsory superannuation to the 12%, correct me if I'm wrong, is that 2022 or 2024, something around then? When that happens, we'll have more of our money going into super. It will hit us in terms of we won't really get wage rises in our pocket now. Instead, that money will go into superannuation. But the money that goes into superannuation over our lifetime will mean pretty much diddly squat to the income we've got to retire on. So we lose both ends. We lose at the retirement end and we lose any meaningful wage increases now. That's a worry.
Yeah, look, certainly it is. I think the Creighton Institute is really right on this one. And might I say, I think it's a real tribute to the Abbott government that you pause the increase to 12%, which is currently scheduled to hit 12 by the 1st of July 2025, I believe. You're quite right. The central argument that Creighton is making, and it's certainly one that I agree with, is that for the bulk of people, they will have lower wages through their working life because of the increase, because, of course, the 12% or the 9.5% will come from gross wages and salaries. But then, of course, they'll have more money in retirement, so they'll actually have less eligibility for the age pension. That was the first argument that Creighton was making. Now, the second one is certainly one that I've been championing a great deal, and that is that overall, from the point of view of the government, the super system actually costs money. So the value of the tax concessions is far greater than the reduction in the age pension outlays. And so therefore, if you didn't have this huge system, at least in theory, you could actually lower everyone's taxes and just leave everyone alone.
And Terry, I think the real worry is that right now people are doing it tough. They want to see a wage increase. We know with bank interest rates, and I've got a note here to remind me, but 8 separate rate cuts have been withheld by the bank. So the RBA's brought down the rate 8 separate times since the GFC. They've not been passed on. Energy prices, we often talk about how fast they are increasing. This is the last time you'd want to increase people's super for no material gain in their retirement incomes when they're desperate for the cash to pay for their lives now.
Peter, let me agree with my good friend Adam in Sydney on one aspect, and that is the super aspect, because clearly it's insane to persist with any increase in the compulsory superannuation, given the reality of the returns that are going to be available in super going forward. But also the fundamental point that Adam is making is that you're not going to save on the pension outlays in future years, and the government itself is in an entirely bipartisan way. Both Labor and the Coalition have said we basically want to force everybody to end up on the old age pension with these limits on what you can have in your superannuation account on retirement. So having agreed with Adam on that front, let me now disagree with him on the story I had today in relation to bank interest rates, because I really found that very surprising, Adam. I thought I was reading, I had to check to see I wasn't reading the Sydney Morning Pravda when I read that piece from you, that yes, they haven't passed on in that simplistic way all those interest rate cuts, but as your own piece said, at the end of the day, the bank net interest margin has actually dropped over those 10 years. So, as you know, the reality of bank funding is a little more complicated and a little more detailed than simply what the Reserve Bank cash rate is. I mean, and with the reduction.
No, that's certainly true, Terry. I agree with all of that. This was just a news story. I wasn't mounting any particular argument. But, you know, it's timely to consider the gap, I think, between the cash rate and mortgage rates in the wake of these two changes. It's an interesting economic factor.
Well, I think what it tells us, Adam, is maybe we shouldn't have brought rates down as low as they are, because, and this is a global problem, not just obviously an Australian one. I can sympathise with the Reserve Bank, but these are unnaturally low interest rates, and it's very hard for an economy to function sensibly at these levels.
Yeah, and this goes to the whole debate that started up again this week about deeming rates and how people with a little bit put aside are hit hard by being deemed to have earned a particular amount of income, even though very few of them do. Related to that, and Terry, you touched on there about superannuation. You and I were both on a unity ticket opposing the changes of Scott Morrison as Treasurer, led by the very able Kelly O'Dwyer at the time, able in inverted commas there, to push through this idea of a cap and to make a whole lot of changes that some they even had to pull because of the unintended consequences. But there was a story today about really a large take-up of people downsizing and using a benefit now to put about $300,000 per person from the sale of a larger home as they downsize into a smaller home, above and beyond their $1.6 million cap into superannuation. Now, I think more people would go down the path of downsizing if you were allowed to put more than the $300K in, and I think it should be more generous. But this goes back to the whole debate we started a couple of years ago, this idea of an arbitrary $1.6 million cap when people are going to live longer. It's just crazy.
Well, absolutely. And I think you've touched on a really much more fundamental point, Peter, that we need a much more holistic, much more whole of government, whole of economy, whole of society approach to these issues. So they're not all in separate boxes. The whole issue of housing, the affordability of housing, the availability of housing, the whole issue of retirement incomes, the whole issue of the budget and how money should be allocated, these are all integrated, and yet we tend to approach them on one-off bases. So,
yeah, portfolio by portfolio, that's how they're done. And you can see it.
Sorry?
They're done portfolio by portfolio.
Well, exactly. Now, I would hope that Josh Frydenberg has got his tax cuts through, he's got his budget surplus on the way, at least in projection. We'll have to see what happens in terms of the economic dynamics. But now I would hope that he's exactly the sort of person, given those successes, that can turn his mind to these sorts of leadership dynamics about making government work more effectively right across the board.
Do you think they can, Adam?
Well, just in terms of that particular policy that you just mentioned, I just wanted to add that I certainly sympathise with the desire to get people to move more easily, but the fundamental problem is that it's just the overwhelming complexity of the retirement system, and in particular the age pension asset test, which excludes housing. I think if the value of everyone's home, and I include the homeowner's home, were included in the age pension test, and you could increase the maximum threshold, say from $800,000 to $3 million or something like that, then you wouldn't have this problem, and you wouldn't need these extremely complicated policies, which I think are very hard to enforce and also to monitor.
On the issue, though, of the home, that's all good and well to put someone's home in there, but if they don't want to move and they've got an entitlement and a right to the pension because they don't have many assets beyond their home, and they've lived in a suburb and it's not their fault, but the suburb has increased over time. They bought a modest home, it's now worth a mozza. They can't afford to do anything to it. They can't afford to put milk in the fridge, and they've got an entitlement to the pension. If you put the home in there as a matter of course, then they're locked out of the pension, which should be their entitlement.
No, certainly. Look, that's a very good argument, and I would never want to see anyone be forced to move. What could happen perhaps is that they'd keep getting the age pension in some circumstances, and of course this is only if the home were very, very valuable, and then when they passed away, the value of the pension would come out of the estate. So no one would be forced to move.
They've been paying taxes all their life, Adam.
Yeah, well, I know there is this belief that the age pension is an entitlement where it was set up in 1909 or whatever it was as something for the very poor, and I think only 20% of households got it, and now I think it's 80% of households get it. So I certainly sympathise with the politics.
I have still got scars on my back from the time that the Abbott government started to talk about extending the age at which you might get the pension. Bearing in mind, when we first brought it in, all those years ago, people were living to sort of 50, 55. They live a lot longer, and so there's a lot longer that they're on the public teat. But anyway, we'll get to that in a moment. Sanjeev Gupta, I want to move to another topic there, Terry. This is the guy, the big industrialist from overseas who's brought up swathes of our renewable energy sector and some of our other energy sectors in Australia. There was an interesting story about how sound his finances might be, or the labyrinth of structures. Interestingly, most of his investments are targeted and built on countries like Australia, where we have huge subsidies for energy. Now, this could be a house of cards, some might say, but it's a real worry that people are coming here and investing in Australia just because we're throwing taxpayer dollars at all this stuff.
Well, there are two things, I think, in this space, Peter. One is the specifics of the way he runs his business empire, and he's been very good at announcing, you know, he can fly in and save Whyalla, he can fly in and save the steel industry in Western Europe, he can fly in and buy British steel. Does he actually end up saving them in the long run? We shall see. And you marry that with the ability to exploit this frenzy, this insane frenzy over force feeding and therefore using taxpayer and consumer dollars to subsidise unreliable so-called renewable energy. And this is a guy that's, you know, he is very good at exploiting both the feel-good factor here and the real actual dollars. Now, whether in fact he's still going to be around in far less 10 years' time will tell.
Adam, just quickly, I've got to go, but I notice he doesn't seem to go where there's not taxpayer subsidies. Look,
it's really outrageous. It's just a reminder that that so many of the profits in the banking sector, which appear at first glance to be free market, really ultimately stem from various government rules and government subsidies. It's quite shameful.
Adam Creighton, Terry McCrann, as always, lots of common sense. Thanks for your insights tonight.